When people hear Italian Navy in World War II, they usually think of a meme, a navy that looks impressive on paper, loses in practice, and becomes shorthand for failure. But that version skips something important. Italy did not enter World War II with a joke navy, and under Benito Mussolini, Italy entered the war with one of the largest fleets in Europe, modernized during the 1930s and built specifically for dominance in the Mediterranean. So before we talk about why the Italian Navy failed, we need to understand what it actually was, because the ships themselves were not the problem. By 1940, the Regia Marina was the fourth largest navy in the world by tonnage. It emphasized speed, heavy guns, surface combat. However, it de-emphasized aircraft carriers, radar, and long-range endurance, and that design philosophy shows up very clearly in its major warships. So we're going to look at 5 representations of Italian ships, spending roughly 2 minutes on each to understand what Italy built and what it expected to fight. The Littorio class represented the peak of Italian naval ambition. These were fast battleships designed to outmaneuver British capital ships in the Mediterranean, and they also featured the Pugliese torpedo defense system. I'm sorry for any Italians. An advanced internal armor concept meant to absorb underwater explosions. On paper, Littorio class ships compared favorably with contemporary British battleships. However, in practice, they suffered from inadequate damage control training, air attack vulnerability, and limited operational time due to fuel shortages. They were not obsolete, they were just underutilized. The Zara-class cruisers are often considered the best treaty cruisers Italy ever built. Italy intentionally violated naval treaties to produce cruisers that could outgun and outlast British counterparts, and in daylight surface combat, they did. They performed well. Their fatal weakness was not firepower, but situational awareness. At the Battle of Cape Matapan, Zara-class cruisers were annihilated at night by radar-equipped British battleships, not because they were poorly built, but because they were blind. Italy built multiple subclasses of Condottieri-class cruisers throughout the 1930s. These ships evolved rapidly, and early versions emphasized extremely high speed but minimal armor. However, later versions corrected this, adding better protection and improved endurance. Their role was reconnaissance and convoy interception in the Mediterranean against destroyers and light forces. They were effective. However, against air attack and submarines, much less so. But again, it's not a design failure, it's a role mismatch. The Soldati class destroyers were among the best Axis destroyer designs of the war. They were fast, aggressive, and well armed for surface engagements, but they suffered from short operational range, weak anti-aircraft armament, and limited radar integration. They were built to fight other ships, not aircraft, and the Mediterranean was increasingly dominated by aircraft. Italy entered World War II with over 100 submarines, one of the largest submarine forces in the world. In confined Mediterranean waters, they were dangerous, but Italy also deployed submarines into the Atlantic, where they performed poorly compared to German U-boats and the Kriegsmarine. Why? Because different tactical doctrine, larger, slower designs, crews trained for Mediterranean operations, and not Atlantic convoy warfare. Once again, the issue was not incompetence, it was misalignment between designs, training, and environment. I could go on, we could keep listing ships, subclasses, refits, and design tweaks, but I really want to get to the why, and looking at these ships, a pattern emerges. Italy built a navy optimized for short-range operations, clear weather, daylight surface battles. However, World War II at sea became a logistics war, an air-dominated war, and incredibly, a radar-driven war. So why did a navy that looked this strong fail anyway? And the answer has far less to do with courage, or memes, and far more to do with industry, fuel, and economics. This is the most important point, and it's one of the one most memes ignore. Italy in the 1930s was not Germany, it was not Britain, and it was not the United States. Italy was still, at its core, a largely agrarian economy. It had limited domestic steel production, minimal coal reserves, and no significant oil reserves. Italy had to import nearly everything required to sustain a modern industrial war. A navy, more than any other branch of the military, is an industrial weapon, and Italy simply did not have the economic depth to fight a prolonged naval war against the British Empire. Now, to use ships, you need oil, and Italy entered World War II with chronically insufficient fuel reserves, and this meant limited training before the war, fewer large-scale fleet exercises, and extremely cautious operational planning. Italian commanders were not timid, they were rationing fuel at the strategic level. By contrast, Britain had global oil access from their colonies, secure Atlantic supply lines, and the ability to absorb losses and keep operating. A navy that cannot train freely, cannot fight flexibly, and flexibility decides naval wars and their outcomes. On a map, on paper, the Mediterranean looks like Italy's home field. However, in reality, it was a British-controlled choke point system. Britain held Gibraltar in the west, Alexandria in the Suez Canal in the east, and Malta in the centre. Malta, in particular, was devastating. It allowed British aircraft and submarines to interdict Italian convoys to North Africa, force the Italian fleet to operate defensively, and turn every supply run into a gamble. Italy wasn't losing battles, it was losing logistics. The Regia Marina was designed for surface combat, and World War II at sea became an air war, a radar war, and a night fighting war. Britain adopted radar early, and Italy lagged behind, like its tanks. This had consequences. At battles like Cape Matapan, Italian ships entered combat without effective radar, while British ships fought with full situational awareness. This was not a failure of bravery or skill, it was technological asymmetry. And finally, we have the fascist manlet himself, Laurel and Hardy. We have Benito Mussolini. Mussolini wanted a short, victorious war, and he entered World War II in 1940 not because Italy was ready, but because he feared being left out of the peace. The Italian Navy was still modernizing, like its tanks, its fuel reserves were inadequate, its air-naval coordination was incomplete, and timing mattered. Italy was pushed into a naval war before its system was ready to sustain one. So why did the Italian naval fail? Not because of it incompetent, not because it lacked courage, but because Italy lacked industrial depth. Italy lacked oil, Italy fought in a hostile logistical environment, and Italy entered the war too early. The Italian Navy was designed for a war it never got to fight. Instead, it fought a global industrial war against an empire built exactly for that. The Italian Navy meme survives because of outcomes easy to mock. But history isn't about jokes, it's about systems. And when you look at the system Italy was operating in, the result stops being funny, and unfortunately, starts being inevitable.